Okay. Can everybody see my title slide?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So just real quick, quick announcement. If anybody needs to leave the Zoom meeting for any reason, please send a chat note and let the West Monroe team know. We're not admitting any further folks to the meeting, just given how far we are on the timeline. So just let us know if you need to leave the Zoom meeting and rejoin for any reason. With that, I'm going to get started here. So my talk is Exotic PowerShell, running PowerShell in interesting places. And I think you'll see why I called this talk Exotic PowerShell. But to be honest, I was struggling to come up with a name for some of the things I'm covering today. One thing that's kind of cool about our current working situation is I'm at home, and because I'm at home, I've got devices all over the place because I'm a device nerd, and that allows me to talk about some of these things. Perhaps unlike the situation where we're at an actual physical event, it's less likely that I'd be wanting to log all these machines and do a live demo, just because of the amount of variables that can happen in that scenario. So I'm thankful in some ways that this is a remote event. Let me see, why is my slide not advancing? Folks see my bio slide? Give me a thumbs up, Ryan, you're on my video.
Yeah, I see it.
Okay, awesome. So I introduced myself earlier, but for anybody who joined late, I'm a senior cloud and infrastructure architect at West Monroe Partners. West Monroe is a business and IT or business and technology consulting firm. We're nationwide in the US, offices all over the country. My team, cloud infrastructure, focuses a lot on basically IT implementations, right? And we build companies from scratch quite literally in a lot of cases. So we want to do that quickly and easily, repeatably. PowerShell comes into play quite a bit there. Steve's picking on my PowerShell or my command prompt slide. Like I said earlier, that's kind of a troll. We do that on purpose. Anyways, I work a lot with Sam, on incident recoveries as well. So again, automation and speed is very important. And we do a lot with kind of discovery, right? So we get in a new client environment that is not ours. We can't necessarily make changes, but we need to maybe get the lay of the land. And so systems inventory is, pretty important in those cases. Let's see, I probably should mention just my interest in RetroPie. For those that don't know, it's a retro video game emulation package. It can run on a few different platforms, but it's primarily based on Raspberry Pi. And actually, we'll talk about that a little bit later. So today, I'm going to talk about what I mean by exotic PowerShell. Some of you may laugh at what I call exotic. Others may be like, yeah, that's exotic. So we'll see how it goes. But I've got lots of examples and demos. In fact, I had to cut quite a bit of that just to manage the time a little bit. But at the end of this talk, I hope you walk away understanding dependencies for installing or using PowerShell. And I don't just mean installing PowerShell 7, I mean that more broadly. And then some key differences for what to expect when you use PowerShell in these exotic locations. Like Sam mentioned, the environments aren't broken, it's more like broken by design. So, it's just kind of interesting when you're working in these environments. And again, you'll see a couple examples of that. And then I guess, the broad theme here is like, you can use PowerShell in weird places, and I hope that you walk away thinking about ways to use it perhaps outside of work for like maybe personal projects. And I'll talk about that a tiny bit. So what do I mean by exotic? Maybe a little Joe exotic? No, not quite, not Joe exotic. One way PowerShell can be exotic is by running it on non-Windows systems. And folks on this call, this is a PowerShell users group, so folks on this call may already be doing this, but I'm sure there's folks that aren't. Maybe they don't have a Mac, for example. So I wanted to talk about macOS and some things to consider there. I have a link here about how to install PowerShell 7 on macOS. And Ryan talked about that a little bit earlier in his talk. But you might be wondering, like, why would you do this? Well, if you are a daily Mac user, you can use PowerShell for administration capabilities. For example, against Azure, Amazon Web Services, Office 365, maybe your Windows environment, like I mentioned in the second bullet. Or, maybe you have a fleet of Macs for some reason and you want to manage them remotely with PowerShell. You can do that as well. Or maybe you just very strongly believe that PowerShell is the one object-oriented language that rule them all. The one counter argument I'll just kind of call out is like, what I hear from people that are Mac or Linux diehards is like, why would I switch? I'm really good at Bash. Why would I switch to PowerShell? And to be honest, I don't have a strong answer for that. If you are really good at Bash and that's your thing, and you don't need to write cross-platform code that works on Windows, then I don't see any reason you wouldn't keep on trucking. But if you are more anchored in the Windows world and you want to extend those skills, or if you need to have more native object-oriented programming capabilities, then I think PowerShell is a pretty cool way to achieve that. So I'm going to flip over to a demo, and this is a live demo, so we'll see how it goes. Bear with me here. I'm going to drag over my remote connection to my macOS machine. This is a VM. Okay, here we go. So this is my Mac VM. And first thing I'm going to do is install PowerShell. Now, I've already taken care of installing Homebrew, which is the package manager for Mac. It's probably anybody who is more like developer inclined likely already has that installed, so you're not really missing much. But the one thing I'll call out is this VM is not the fastest, and I actually had to run it twice because I got errors the first time, just so it can complete all its dependencies and not time out. But with that installed and out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and install PowerShell now with this brewcast command. So this will just take maybe a minute of paint drying while this is running. But as soon as this is done, I'll be able to start up PowerShell on this Mac. And you can see it's running. And one thing to notice, if you can read this, you're going to see it like flashing all kinds of different commands in the terminal title bar, which is kind of neat. So it's kind of a little bit transparent about what it's doing. So it's downloading right now. Grabbing some deltas. And sorry for the paint drying, but this should just take a minute or so. I'm watching the chat, and Todd asks, are you going to run the same PowerShell script in each host? Not exactly. You'll see some commonalities across the work the demos I'm going to be doing today, but I'm not literally running the same PowerShell script. However, you could easily extend some of the things I'm doing today to make one PowerShell script, for example, to do systems inventory and gather some basic OS information. Not just is this Windows or is it Linux or is this Mac OS? That's built in PowerShell, which I'll show in a moment. But more, distribution specific or version specific information. And Steve mentioned kind of called out objects as a great way to, or a great reason to run PowerShell on Mac OS, and then piping is another good reason. I agree with that. Although, like Ryan mentioned, he doesn't like pipelining. So you might not win everybody with that comment, but it makes sense.
We can agree to disagree and still be friends.
That's right. Okay, so it's asking me for a password, and this is because for those that are coming from Windows, this is like a UAC prompt, basically, is the best way I'd equate that. Okay, it is done. So now I can do, I can run, oops, sorry, dyslexic today. So starting up here, and okay, so now I'm in a PowerShell prompt and I'm on Mac, and I'm gonna go ahead and run, sorry about this yellow font, by the way. There's probably a way to change that. You're gonna see yellow font periodically, annoyingly. There's probably, like I said, there's probably a way to change that. I haven't quite figured it out because I'm not a Mac expert. But if I just run, $ is Mac OS and I get true, I know I'm on a Mac. There's also some built-in variables for, is this Windows, is Windows in other words, or is Linux? Right, and those are false, as you might imagine, because I'm on Mac OS. Now, some of you probably already knew that because you're coming from having some experience with maybe PowerShell Core 6, and that's when those were introduced. I'm going to run get computer info, which is a command that I recently found out about, and sadly, get computer info does not exist on Mac. If you haven't tried that on Windows, go ahead and try it now while you're listening to me. And it takes a minute to run or so, but it pulls all kinds of useful information that you can, key off of to make decisions or maybe inform an inventory process or whatever it is you're doing. But unfortunately, it doesn't exist on Mac. So one of the things you could do with that is get the operating system version. And let's say that's what I'm really trying to do on this Mac. So I've got a little command here to go ahead and do that. So I'm just going to paste that in. I've got a cheat sheet off on my margin here. So I can run this to get the macOS version. I forget tab completion doesn't work quite the same. So if I run that, and notice I casted it to a PowerShell version, right? This is where the native object-oriented capabilities come into play. I took what ultimately is a string and converted it to a version object in PowerShell, and here I can get major. Oops, sorry. I can get major version. I can get minor. So I can interact with this just like you would, any PowerShell object, which is pretty cool. I'm on 10.15.4, which is the latest release. So yay me. And the next thing I was going to demonstrate is just setting up this Mac for remote connectivity and then connecting from my Windows machine to this Mac. So the first thing I need to do is go to System Preferences and go to Sharing. And basically what I'm going to be doing is turning on SSH. So let's see, so remote login, I got to turn that on. And then I need to rename this machine. I guess I don't need to rename it, but having spaces in your computer name is not something I recommend. And it really makes it confusing when you're trying to connect because it doesn't actually have spaces in it. So I'm going to call this, I'm just using my home naming convention. Okay, and there's no save button in Mac, you just close it. So that's it. With that, now I'm going to just check out the path for PowerShell. It should be here, and it is. All right, that's what I would expect, but I'm just validating that PowerShell is where I expect it because I'm going to need that in a later command. And next, I need to edit the SSH server configuration. So I'm going to open that up, and here that is. And I'm scrolling down, and I want to make sure that password authentication is enabled. Here it is. So I think this means it is enabled. It's commented out with a yes, but I'm just going to remove that to make sure. And the next thing I'm going to do is tell this to utilize the PowerShell subsystem. So paste in a little command off my cheat sheet here. And there it is. So the PowerShell subsystem should execute this pwsh command. Remember I checked the path earlier with those parameters supplied. And that's it. I'm going to write the file and I'm going to exit. And I'm going to start praying to the demo gods that this works. Here's my PowerShell 7 window on my machine. Oh, you know what? I forgot one step. Apologies, 1 second. I need to restart the SSH daemon on macOS. So we'll stop it and then we will start it. Okay, should be good now. And let me bring that PowerShell window back over. So this is my computer, just to prove that. There it is. This is my everyday laptop. And I'm going to do an enter session command. So it takes a second here. It's doing a broadcast to find that machine. Oh, I forgot to clear my SSH keys. Okay, 1 second. I have the fix for that. It's doing this because I restored my VM from a snapshot and the SSH key regenerated, which looks pretty shady. It looks like a man in the middle attack or person in the middle attack. Let's be PC here. All right, trying that again. Looking at the chat while I'm waiting here, and I'm seeing lots of jokes about the color scheme, and I totally agree. So here we go. So since I cleared my SSH keys, it's asking, do I want to trust this machine? And I'm going to type yes. This confused me the first time because even though you don't see anything on the screen, I did type yes. I thought something was broken. So anyway, I added it to my list of known hosts, and now I'm going to enter my password for my macOS account. And here we go. I'm on. So now I can say is Mac OS and true. I'm on the same system. And you can see that the pathing has changed to a / base pathing, right? Because I'm on basically a free BSD instead of a Windows machine. Ryan, you're off mute. Were you going to heckle me or ask a question?
No, not at all.
Cool. No worries. Just checking. All right. So that's my quick macOS demo. For those that haven't seen that, I think that's pretty cool. Next thing I'll talk about is running PowerShell on Linux machines. So it's not that much different than running it on macOS. So I'm not going to demo, the exact same thing I just did. I think that'd be a little pedantic. But just basically know that the rationale is the same for why you would do this. It's just that I'd say there are a lot more Linux servers out there than there are, Mac OS machines that you need to remotely administer. So remotely administering a Linux server with PowerShell is a very common use case for this. And I just want to call out that there are a ton of, there's a ton of distributions in general out there for Linux, and there's pretty good supportability in the PowerShell world in terms of what is supported. Ryan covered this a little bit, but I just wanted to show this in like a graphical way. Because I think it's important to look at Debian for a second. Ubuntu, Raspbian, and Kali are the three distributions kind of like right here if you're seeing my mouse, and just to the right of Debian. They're derived from Debian, right? Debian is the most well-supported distribution from a PowerShell perspective. And I say that because the latest version of Debian is supported by the PowerShell team. Contrasting that with Ubuntu, which is a very common Linux distribution, the latest version of Ubuntu is not yet supported, at least on paper or on the docs page, by the PowerShell team. I hope that changes in the near future. Like Ryan mentioned, it seems like their roadmap is focused more on extending compatibility, and I would like to think that that would extend to newer distributions of Linux, but hard to say exactly. And then the other thing I'll mention is that a lot of these distributions are only community supported, which means if you're using PowerShell and run into an issue, your ability to get support is really limited to forums and that kind of support channel. You can't call Microsoft support with a production outage, in other words. So I hope this makes sense. It's a little bit of an eye chart, but just kind of a quick visual way to see which distributions are supported. And any of the ones that have the double dagger are those that don't, that basically PowerShell does not have support for the latest version. Again, that doesn't mean it doesn't work, but it means it's not officially supported. I can tell you for certain that the latest version of Raspbian, you can install PowerShell on it. In fact, one of my only pull requests on GitHub that I completed was submitting a docs change to allow that to happen. So humble brag there. So on to my next exotic topic, running PowerShell in the cloud can be kind of exotic in some ways, especially for folks that haven't seen this before. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Cloud Shell. It's a web-based PowerShell prompt. So if you don't have if you're on a Chromebook or something, or you just don't have a computer you can make changes to, then Cloud Shell could be an answer for that. Or if you want to connect to Azure or Office 365 resources and not have to do MFA again at your PowerShell prompt because you're already in the Azure portal and maybe you've already completed MFA, that could be another use case that I've seen. You just need an Azure subscription, a storage account, and a file share for this. It's pretty simple, and don't let those things scare you. Subscriptions equals money, but this thing is like pennies unless you're doing some serious heavy work in Cloud Shell. I mean, it's like pennies per month. So I've got this tied to my credit card and I don't even really notice any charges. But let me pull up the Azure portal. I have it somewhere here. One sec, here it is. Okay, so this is just my personal Azure subscription. And if you've used Azure, this is very familiar, but perhaps some folks are new. Again, you need to make sure you have a subscription, a resource group, and a storage account. So those are the three things you need. Once you have those, you can click on the Cloud Shell icon, which is up here in the upper right. And I'm going to zoom this temporarily just so you can see it. I'm going to have to zoom back out because the PowerShell prompt will get screwed up if I keep it zoomed. But it's right here. It's a little icon. If you don't have, by the way, if you don't have a subscription, a storage account, or if you don't have a resource group, a storage account, or a file share set up, running Cloud Shell for the first time will prompt you to set those things up so you can kind of get that going pretty quickly if you sort of don't know what you're doing.
You say the file shares Azure files?
Yeah, it's like an Azure file share coming off your storage account. Wix is probably laughing at me because I might be missaying that slightly, but that's pretty much what's happening. So let me zoom back out, and I'm going to click on this PowerShell prompt. And what I'll do here when this gets going, it looks pretty zoomed in. Brian, can you read that okay? I assume so. Yeah, okay. So you see it's requesting a Cloud Shell. It's connecting the terminal. And again, this is my web browser. And just to prove that, I'm going to just drag it around. See, that's my web browser very clearly, right? Okay, and I'm in. Here we go, PowerShell, right? Great. That's cool. And obviously you've seen the use case here. But if you're like me, I always wonder, like, well, what the heck is this thing? Great, I can use it and I can start clicking away at PowerShell. That's cool. But if you, to me, I always like to know what's like under the hood. So the first thing I did is I ran PS version table. And you can see so Ryan mentioned this earlier, but it's core. It's a core edition, right? So that's a hint. It's also PowerShell version 7, okay? And we've got an OS line item here that lists out Linux. So I'm seeing right out of the gate that this is some variant of Linux, and it's running PowerShell version 7. Oh yeah, and you're seeing Ubuntu. Yes, good point. I didn't notice that when I looked at this earlier. Yes, thank you. The other thing I like to know if I'm kind of on a foreign system is like, okay, what PowerShell modules are here, because that might be a hint as to what I can do with this thing. So I'm going to do a get module, and I can see that the AZ modules are here. In other words, the Azure modules. I have an Azure AD module installed, and that's about it, other than some of the built-in stuff. So I know I can interact with Azure and Azure AD right out of the gate. It's interesting, just as a kind of a sidebar, that Cloud Shell is updated frequently, and modules are sometimes added and removed. I just had a question in the chat to do list available, so let's do that. It's a good question. They are added and removed periodically, so yeah, there's a lot more AZ modules installed here. But broad stroke, I don't see. Oh, we've got an Exchange Online one here. I was just going to kind of mention that Exchange Online used to be built in. And what's interesting, Danny, I don't know if he mentioned this or not in his talk, but Exchange Online requires full Diesel Windows PowerShell, or excuse me, full Diesel .NET framework, meaning like you need a Windows machine to run the Exchange Online module, right? It makes sense because that's the only place you can get full .NET framework, as opposed to .NET Core, which is what PowerShell 7 is based on, right? So let me just let that sink in for a second. I just said you need full .NET framework, which means you need a Windows machine to run the Exchange Online module. Then how is there an Exchange Online module here in Cloud Shell, which I just showed you is based on Linux? I don't know. There's a secret version of that module here for some of the Microsoft folks, I guess. Anyway, we know it's Linux because we just saw that, but unsurprisingly can run is Linux, and it's true, right? So that's pretty obvious. And let's pretend you didn't see that it was Ubuntu. And we just wanted to kind of know a little bit more about what is this thing really, right? Well, I'm going to run a couple helper functions here. And by the way, I forgot to mention, I'm going to post this code on GitHub within about 24 hours. So sorry, but I'm going to gloss over some of these functions that I'm going to use just to support what I'm doing. But let me paste those in. And next, I'm going to create some backwards compatible hash tables. I'll just say backwards compatible and leave it at that. Explain myself a little bit later about what I mean by that. But I'm not using like the normal syntax to create a hash table for a reason. And it's probably because I'm a stubborn middle-aged person. All right, so now I'm in here and I'm gonna run quite the mishmash of code that I've written to detect some information about Linux environments. And I'm sorry, I'm sure people would be interested in the details, but just in the interest of time, I'm gonna paste this and post it on GitHub for later review. So that's gonna go. It's basically an if-else tree of many conditions and different ways to check Linux distributions. Almost done. These red hats. Okay, almost there. There we go. Now I'm going to display what this thing retrieved. So here's my hash table of OS information. And you can see here it's Ubuntu. It is 16.04.06, so pretty far from a recent release, actually. It's still supported, but it's kind of an older release, which is interesting. And what else? I guess if you didn't know that Ubuntu is based on Debian, you can see that here as well. So I think that's pretty cool because one of the things, like Sam mentioned, we do when we get into a new environment is we want to get lay of the land, but at the same time not make any changes. And this is a way to do that to the extent PowerShell exists. So that's pretty cool. And that is my Linux demo. So let me flip back, or excuse me, my Cloud Shell demo. And I implicitly did some Linux stuff there for y'all. So I skipped that. These are the things just as a recap, this is what I demoed though. I fired up Cloud Shell. I showed you what version of PowerShell. I pulled some basic OS information, and then we did a deep dive to see what OS it was, really. Next up, running PowerShell on weird versions of Windows can be exotic. And one of those weird versions of Windows can be derived from Docker containers. So I'm going to pull up a administrative command prompt that I meant to have open already. I just neglected to do that. So it might pause my screen share for a moment when I get the UAC prompt. But I'm going to keep talking while this happens. So for those that don't know much about containers, they're kind of like virtual machines, but not exactly. They work functionally the same way, I would say, in a lot of cases, but they share, running multiple containers on one host means that they're sharing the same OS kernel. So it's a little bit more efficient from that perspective. Sorry, long password, you got to concentrate. And this UAC prompt is just taking forever. Sorry, folks. Can't see my slide. Can't see you. Be right with you. There we go. Okay. When you fire up Docker, for those that haven't used it, you have to choose your allegiance to Linux or Windows containers. You cannot mix and match. It's important to know because if you're trying to test out weird versions of Windows, you need to make sure that Docker is configured to work with weird versions of Windows. And I'll pull this up in a second. Oh, sorry, one more note. It's really important because like I mentioned, the container is sharing the kernel with the operating system, right? That's a fundamental design decision or fundamental operating principle with containers. And so with that in mind, when you're thinking about Windows and you're using containers, you need to make sure that the Windows version on your host or whatever it is that's running Docker matches that of the containers that you're running. So I'm on Windows 10 1909. That means I can run Windows 1909 containers. That makes sense? I cannot run 2004 containers, however, let's pretend those were available. I can't run those yet. So let me, I've got my prompt open. I'm going to open up the Docker repository here. 1 second. Just drag that over. Here it is. Ryan mentioned this earlier in terms of how to run PowerShell on Docker. And let me zoom this slightly. All Docker repositories look this way. They all have a standard format. And I will tell you that my #1 gripe with these Docker repositories is they all tell you to just copy and paste simple code here in the upper right and you can get rolling. And serious kudos to the PowerShell team because they're the only ones that are maintaining what's called the latest tag. This is apparently something optional that can mean whatever the developer wants it to mean. It doesn't necessarily always mean it's the latest container version available. It can literally mean whatever. And a lot of times it's not defined. So that's kind of frustrating when you're trying to get started and the documentation is telling you to do one thing, but reality matches something else. So I'm going to copy that. And let me see, is there anything else? I mentioned the latest tag. Okay, my demo. So I'm going to fire up Docker. And to do that, I'm going to go fire up Docker desktop. I just recently rebooted, so this is not running. Oh, I need to run it as an admin, silly me. Again, I'm going to get a UAC prompt here, so 1 second. Okay, that is going to be starting. Let's see if I can show you that starting. It takes a second and it'll appear in my tray here. Come on, baby. Docker, Docker, Docker. There it goes. It's down here. So it's starting, and it's probably hard to see, but it's got these little graph-looking lines going up and down. Reminds you of an equalizer, digital equalizer. It's starting. And while that's starting, let me drag over my command prompt. There it is. And where is my cheat sheet? There it is. Okay. Again, I'll post this stuff for everybody on my GitHub here within about 24 hours. So let me see if Docker started. It probably has by now. Yes. Okay, great. I'm going to run that Docker command that you saw in the PowerShell repository. Now, I'm not specifying the latest tag, right? I could do this if I wanted, but omitting a tag means it's going to automatically try and run the latest tag. So here we go. And I'm really hoping that there's been no updates because this would take quite a while to download and really torpedo my demo. I pulled this last night, so hopefully this starts in a jiffy. So what I'm going to tell you next is when this loads and starts, I'm going to be in a PowerShell prompt, right? That's great. I know it's Windows because I've got Docker configured for Windows, and you're going to see that the command line is going to look Windows-esque. So I know I'm on some variant of Windows, but I really don't know much else than that. And again, just like like we mentioned earlier, I want to kind of get more information. So I'm not going to run PS version table. I could, but we see it's on version 7 because of the header at the top. If you didn't believe me that this is Windows, we could do is Windows, and you're going to see true, right? I can run get computer info. Remember I told you about that handy dandy command earlier. So let's do that. So that's going to run, and I'm storing the output in the variable comp info. And I'm going to display, there's a ton of information in get computer info, and I'm just going to display the properties I want to pull forward here. So OS version is clearly Windows 10. It's got a build number there for us. It's 1903 supposedly, and I think 18362 is 1903. That sounds right. But let's say I want to know a little bit more information. All that tells me is like what build number Windows is. It doesn't tell me anything else about like what flavor of Windows this is. Is it Windows? Is it Windows Server? I really don't know. So let's pull some more information. So I'm going to use more properties of comp info for that. So I can get the operating system SKU, which is an integer. This is a Windows thing. It's giving me the integer of the SKU, which, as you're seeing in some of these edition IDs and whatnot, you're seeing that this is a server core edition of Windows, and it specifically is data center. So this Docker container is running Windows Server Data Center Edition Server Core. So now I've narrowed down what this is running, and we know it's PowerShell version 7. So now we're getting somewhere. I like to look and see what's going on and like what's under the covers. So I was curious to know like what's the host name? Oh, it's some randomly generated host name. Makes sense. And then who am I? Well, I'm a container administrator, and my domain name apparently is user manager, which is kind of interesting.
With a space in it.
With a space, yeah. Don't ask me. I don't know. So if I've had enough of this Docker container, I wouldn't call this particularly exotic because I'm on Windows Server, which is certainly mainstream. I'm on Server Core, which has been in existence since Windows Server 2008. So again, not incredibly exotic. Right? A lot of people have probably worked with Server Core, and if you don't already know, it's the command line variant of Windows Server, but it has like a lot of the normal stuff in it, like full.NET framework. Obviously, it has PowerShell. It's fairly mainstream. All it is missing is really your normal graphical user interface. So I'm going to type exit, which will kick me out of this Docker container, and I'm going to run something a little bit more exotic next, and that is Nano Server. So Nano Server, again, is not incredibly new. It's been around for a little bit, but I don't know if anybody's looked into Nano Server. It's kind of a pain in the butt to build a Nano Server image, or at least it was historically. And I want to say, when I say historically, I want to say that this was available from the initial release of Server 2016 up until I think 1709 is when you could build your own Nano Server image. You can no longer do that. The only way to run Windows Server Nano Center, or just, excuse me, Nano Server. The only way to run Nano Server now is in a container. So we know it's a Nano Server because you saw my Docker command, and I'm sitting here telling you I ran Nano Server. But let's go ahead, let's pretend I just happened upon this OS instance and I really don't know anything about it. Let's go ahead and get computer info like I did previously. Wah, wah. Get computer info doesn't work. That stinks, right? This is Windows, and you would expect get computer info to work because I'm in PowerShell 7. But Nano Server doesn't have all the capabilities of a normal Windows box, and specifically it's lacking things like WMI. So, okay, well, you might infer that this is a Nano Server by, like, I guess tacitly by this not working, but to me that's not really a proper way to do that. So instead, we can query the registry and get some information about the installed operating system. And if you saw that, I basically went into Software, Microsoft Windows NT current version. And this gives me build information. And notice that this is 1909 because that's what I ran. And it's clearly a nano server based on the edition ID. So I think that's pretty interesting. I'm not going to do much else than that other than just kind of show you that, hey, I'm on nano server, and that's kind of unique because of how much of a pain in the butt it was to build nano server, and also the fact that you can only run it in a container now. So I hope that was somewhat interesting. Let me exit this container and get back to business with our presentation. So the other thing is, and some of you may laugh at this or maybe cringe a little bit, but running PowerShell on older versions of Windows is also pretty exotic. And I want to be clear, like, I don't advocate doing this. Like, I'm not telling you to spin up Windows XP in your environment and run PowerShell on it, because that would obviously be a pretty significant security risk because the operating system is end of life, as is the version of PowerShell running on it. But like Sam mentioned, a lot of times we run into client environments that, you know, like, let's be honest, they got ransomware, right? There's probably some underlying people, process, technology issues in the environment, one of which may be running end-of-life operating systems. So again, I'm not endorsing running these older operating systems for any reason, but the fact is, like, I often write code that needs to work on these older operating systems. So it's not sexy, but it is something I do. And I just want to call out, like, PowerShell 1 was a great achievement when it was released, but I put works great in quotes on purpose because there are a ton of limitations. If you want to buy me a beer, I'll tell you all about error handling and backward compatible error handling at that. That's probably an hour-long talk in and of itself and probably would bore a lot of people. So I'm not going to go too far down that road today, but yeah, anyway, there's a lot of limitations. Like, there's no hash tables in Box. You saw me earlier run some, quote, backward compatible code to build a hash table, and I use that code as kind of a scaffold for my work because I know it is backward compatible with version 1. So you'll see if you look at my code and scrutinize it, you'll see I do weird things because I make sure that things work in a backwards compatible manner. The main use case I care about, though, is being able to detect and inventory these systems, because if you cannot detect them, then you don't know they're there, and that could lead to possible continued cybersecurity problems. So that's my spiel on that. I'm not going to demonstrate anything there, but I do talk about some of that in my next talk. So the other thing that's exotic is running PowerShell on non-x86 systems, and specifically running it on ARM systems. So some of you might be like, what the heck is ARM? ARM is a completely or drastically different CPU architecture than probably what most of you are used to. The processors or CPUs that are in most of your computers are derived from Intel x86 architecture. And of course, AMD has an adopted variant of that, right? But it's kind of the same systems architecture that's been in mainstream use for decades. I mean, it's by far the most common. But ARM is this, like, emerging, I mean, it's been emerged, frankly, but let's just say it's emerging for argument's sake. And it's a reduced instruction set compared to Intel. So what that means is basically the CPU does less of the heavy lifting and pushes that down to the software more so. So you might imagine that software needs to be specifically designed for ARM CPUs in order for it to run. In other words, it needs to be compiled for the ARM CPU architecture. And if you're wondering, like, well, why do I care about this? ARM CPUs can be found everywhere. Earlier in the chat, we were talking about running PowerShell against, GPUs or graphics card processors. That's not too unusual to me because PowerShell can run on ARM as well. And I know they're not exactly the same, but they're both reduced instruction set in a lot of cases. But ARM CPUs are in just about every single cell phone. And in fact, I can't think of a single cell phone in recent history that doesn't have an ARM CPU. They're in set-top boxes. Like, I have an NVIDIA Shield TV that runs an ARM CPU. They're in all Raspberry Pi devices, which are the little, credit card size handheld single board computers that are so popular with hobbyists. And they're certainly in specialized devices. And the other thing that's pretty interesting is they're in a lot of, they're in a few Windows devices. Most notably the Surface Pro X, which I sadly cannot afford because it's like $2,000. But pretty cool stuff. So, I know we've been talking a lot about new stuff like PowerShell 7. keep in mind, and I think Ryan might have mentioned this in his talk a little bit, but PowerShell 7 and really PowerShell Core 6 as well, its predecessor, runs on .NET Core. And so PowerShell, because PowerShell requires .NET Core, PowerShell can only run in places where .NET Core can run, right? Makes sense. But think of it this way, really anywhere where .NET Core can run, you can probably get PowerShell to work. There are limitations, and yes, it may not be supported, but it can probably be made to happen. So the places where Microsoft supports that currently are Windows 10 IoT Core, which is the ARM 32-bit flavor of Windows 10 that runs on a few different systems, but I would say is most popular on the Raspberry Pi, and I actually have one available. I would demo it if we had more time, but we just don't have the time. And then the other place that you would see this on an ARM processor is Raspberry Pi, I would say. I guess I should mention though that of course PowerShell 7 can be installed on so this is technically a little bit incorrect because you can run PowerShell 7 on the Surface Pro, or excuse me, the what am I talking about? The Surface Pro X. That's it, as well as some other Windows 10 laptops that run on ARM. And just a quick call out. This is a bit of an edge case, but don't forget about older PowerShell versions. I'm kind of combining the previous talk, old versions of Windows with with ARM and Windows 8 RT, as much as this makes me cringe a little bit, did have PowerShell version 3 in box. So you could encounter PowerShell version 3 on an ARM CPU architecture. Likewise, Windows 8.1 RT ran PowerShell version 4. And of course, you can encounter PowerShell version 5.1 on Windows 10 IoT Core or the Surface Pro X or some other devices. And you might be asking like, okay, that's great, Frank, but why do I care about this? And of course, there's like legitimate Internet of Things type activities, which, I don't know, I roll my eye a little bit at that because I just don't think people are using PowerShell there. Maybe I'm wrong. I'd be happy to be wrong. And in fact, I think that'd be a great Chicago PowerShell users group talk in something in the future, but I'm not aware of anybody actually using PowerShell in an IoT fashion besides like a proof of concept. But the one thing I will share is that this can make for a lot of fun projects. And I'm just going to drag my other camera over just so it's big for everybody. I've got a arcade machine right here, and if Andrew Johnson's still on, he knows what I'm talking about here. But this is a little Pi-Cade arcade machine running with a Raspberry Pi in the back, and I do have PowerShell on it. I don't have anything I'm going to demo on that today because I frankly just haven't had time to finish what I was working on, but I'm basically automating some system configuration with PowerShell, which I think would be pretty cool. And for anybody who's a RetroPie nerd, which is what that's running, RetroPie just released a new version, so I probably have to scrap some of the work I've already done. Oh well, that's okay. I'd rather take the new version of RetroPie. So anyway, I've got a quick demo here. I talked about a fun project. I've got a quick demo here for detecting ARM CPUs because there are some key differences that I want to make you aware of. So give me a second just to get my bearings here. I've got to turn my Windows 10 ARM device on. It's sitting right next to me. It's not a Surface Pro X, it's a Lenovo C630. Okay, so that is on, and I'm going to drag my Screen Connect session over. One moment. Okay, I'm just waiting for it to reconnect. The thing went to sleep on me, so sorry about that. Give me 1 second, and while that's connecting, I'm going to reopen up my connection to my Raspberry Pi, which is the next thing I'm going to show. Close. There we go. Okay. Come on. Okay, it's just working on retrying. Give me a second here, guys and gals. Okay. Come on, you can do it. All right, well, maybe I'll come back to that while it's thinking about it. I'll bring my Raspberry Pi over and we'll just kind of reorder this demo real quick. I'm probably a little bit over on time, sorry about that, but this is my last set of demos, so we're almost there. What the heck? Oh, I'm an idiot. Okay, here we go. So this is a Raspberry Pi 4 that's sitting on my desk. It is running Raspbian, which is the Raspberry Pi flavor of Linux, or specifically it's a flavor of Debian. And I already have PowerShell version 7 installed. So all good stuff there. And what I want to do is run a few commands here. 1 second. Okay, I'm going to paste in some helper code. So this will take a second. Okay, that's quick. And I've got another kind of if-else tree here that I'm going to paste in. And basically what this is going to do is pull some information about this machine. And this code that I just pasted in, I know you can't see the code, but it'll be up on GitHub. It works on both Windows and Linux / macOS. So it is cross-platform capable. And it's basically creating some variables that tell me some information about the underlying CPU or system architecture. So let's just play all these variables. Some of these are going to be populated and some won't. It just kind of depends on what system you're on. So, so first of all, I have this system architecture, also known as machine hardware name in Linux, and that is showing up as ARM v7. I think that's an L. So ARM version 7 is the CPU in the Raspberry Pi that's sitting at my desk. At least I think that's right. I guess I'd have to double check. But anyway, this is a Raspberry Pi 4 in any case. Notice that processor architecture comes up unknown, and as does OS architecture, which isn't particularly helpful. And process, so not process or meaning the CPU, but process meaning this PowerShell window comes up as null, no result there. And that's just an artifact because I'm on Linux and it doesn't have I don't have a way coded, a cross-platform way coded to determine what architecture the underlying PowerShell process is. So this is not particularly helpful because some of these come up unknown, but you can at least see that the system architecture is ARM-based, and so I'd be able to key off that and make some decisions. Now, let's see, I bet you my other system is probably online. So let me drag my other Screen Connect window over. It is not online. One moment. That's really unusual. Sorry, folks, 1 sec. Live demos, gotta love it. Okay, well, let me try an audible while that's thinking. And maybe it'll come up while I'm doing this audible. What I'm gonna do is connect to my Windows 10 IoT device, Windows 10, IoT core device. And I'll run the same, that's running on Raspberry Pi as well, so it's still informative in terms of what I'm trying to demonstrate. So I'm gonna run some code that isn't necessarily relevant to my demo, but it'll just kind of help me connect remotely. Oh, shoot. I pasted that into my macOS session. Oops. All right. So that's that. And now, 1 second, I need to do this. Okay. And then I need to connect to this session. So I'm going to connect to the PowerShell version 7 endpoint that's running on the Windows 10 IoT core device. This takes a second. Probably not surprisingly, but not surprising, but like these Raspberry Pi devices running even this like slimmed down version of Windows 10 are not exactly the fastest. So a question from Todd in the chat, have I had any experience running PowerShell on multiple threads on a Linux or non-Windows environment? I have not, and I assume you're referring to like jobs or something like that. I've not personally tried that. He said yes. So yeah, again, I've not personally tried that, but it's an interesting question, and I would imagine that's probably a little bit easier with PowerShell version 7 and the parallel for each processing, although that may not be exactly your question. All right, so I'm connected and I'm on the Windows 10 IoT machine, and I'm going to go ahead and run that same code that I just ran on the actual Raspbian, or Linux variant. So pasting this in, this will take a hot minute because hilariously Windows is kind of slow when you paste in code in this manner. So Todd asked, when you're running in PowerShell, is it basically running in single thread compartment mode? I don't know the answer to that, Todd, but I assume so. There are ways to flip that around to MTA or multi-thread apartment mode. But that's like at a .NET layer that I, to be honest, don't fully understand. I don't want to make myself sound too stupid, but I have explored that a little bit because that flavor or that behavior does vary depending on what version of PowerShell you're on. And I've gotten pretty deep in the bowels of PowerShell, more so than I care to admit, trying to work around some of that behavior in getting things to work on PowerShell version 1 without much success. Anyway, my demo completed, and notice that it's very similar system architecture. It's ARM-based, but I got different results because this is Windows, and Windows will say ARM when it's an ARM32 system. I was going to show you an ARM64 system, but I don't know why my Lenovo laptop is just not responding. So apologies for not being able to demonstrate that. The one thing I was going to mention, though, that you should be aware of, and this is more of a Windows thing than a PowerShell thing, but Windows 10 on a ARM 64-bit system can run 32-bit x86 programs through an emulation layer. So what's kind of interesting is if you have one of these devices and you open up Windows PowerShell 5.1, the old, the inbox version of Windows PowerShell, and you run this code I just showed on the screen, it would show that it's an x86 process, which is confusing because it's an ARM CPU, right? So that's a little weird. So PowerShell, it's like they did not compile PowerShell 5.1, Windows PowerShell 5.1 for ARM, which is fine. It's probably for compatibility reasons or something. But it's something to be aware of, is that that version of Windows PowerShell is x86 on those systems. However, if you install Windows PowerShell 7 and run it, it does run on as native ARM 64, and so that's what you would see. So just a quick call out there. And I think in the interest of time, I'm going to drag this over, and I think that might be, yeah, that's the end of my talk. So I'm sorry, a little over time here, I think, but let me just recap what I covered. So I talked about exotic PowerShell, and to me that means running it in weird places, right? Like macOS, Linux, Azure Cloud Shell, Docker, really old versions of Windows. I know people cringe, but PowerShell version 1, I like to make sure my stuff works there. And then ARM. So these are all things to be aware of as far as platforms that are out there from a PowerShell perspective. I covered lots of examples and demos, some of which I have code for, but just didn't get a chance to demo. I'll put that on GitHub as well, just why not? And maybe if there's a talk in the future and people are interested, I can go over some of this in more detail and cover those talks that I didn't get a chance to today. But anyway, hopefully you kind of get a flavor for what it means to be working with PowerShell in these kind of oddball environments, and some things that work and other things that don't, and also some cross-platformy things you need to be aware of as far as detecting what OS you're in and things like that. But I guess the point is, as you walk away, don't be afraid to use this for personal projects, like on a Raspberry Pi, for example. I think it's fun to kind of marry the work environment with some fun personal projects. So I'll shut up for a minute and see if there's any questions. I've been kind of answering them along the way as folks have been posting them because I'm able to see the chat, but maybe Amanda has received some private messages, or maybe folks have additional questions.
Yeah, I'll go through the private messages first, and then we can circle back if anyone posted any that didn't get covered. So the first one I have, when running PowerShell in the Azure environment, does it default to single thread mode like any other PowerShell?
Yeah, I tried to answer that. I think the answer is yes, but I don't know that for certain because I just haven't explored that explicitly. But I do know if that's a problem, you can, I believe I'm nearly confident, although getting a little bit over my skis here, that there are ways to flip to MTA or multi-threaded apartment mode as needed. So you can do that to some extent if that's a use case that you have. I just don't know what the default is.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. Looks like we did cover that. I think that was my only question I got sent privately.
Okay, no problem.
Oh,
Go ahead.
I have,
I'm gonna start getting set up for my
Sorry.
next talk, but go ahead.
no, you're good. Have you had experience running PowerShell in multiple threads on a Linux or non-Windows environment?
No, I think I addressed that verbally. At least I did in my head. No, that's fine. I'll answer it. So
Was that the same question I just had? These are
no,
similar.
it's different. It's different. We're getting pretty low level here, Amanda. So no worries. I have not tried that personally. To be honest, like my experience working with PowerShell in non-Windows environments is mostly systems inventory and kind of tooling around with personal projects, and also just kind of advancing my own knowledge of non-Windows systems. So I don't know the answer to that because I haven't really had to run a job on on a Linux machine. Keeping in mind that usually I'm trying not to make any changes. I'm just trying to get the lay of the land. So a little bit of an excuse, but just being honest, I haven't had a chance to test that.
Okay.
Anything else?
Cool. Nope, I think that's it.
And